Occupy Wall Street, que se instalou no centro financeiro de Nova York. Chegou-se à erupção repentina nas cidades brasileiras no ano passado, com as periódicas explosões de violência por alguns subgrupos, como os Black Blocs. Protestos começam com uma ou outra causa específica para atacar: desemprego na Espanha, preços de ônibus no Brasil, corrupção na Ucrânia, e logo se ampliam para questionar muito mais. A mídia busca líderes, mas não encontra. Porta-vozes? Qualquer um. Listas de reivindicações específicas para negociar não aparecem. Partidos políticos tradicionais são rechaçados. Os manifestantes operam conforme o que alguns chamam de horizontalidade, se ampliando para os lados, em contraste com a hierarquia vertical de movimentos semelhantes no passado. Em conjunto, os protestos exibem um aspecto anárquico, parte desobediência civil, parte agressão, parte ocupação de espaço público. O antropólogo americano militante David Graeber, professor da London School of Economics, é uma inspiração teórica internacional para muitos dos participantes desses movimentos de rua. Foi ele que cunhou a expressão "nós somos os 99%", referindo-se à maioria da população contra o 1% da elite. Conhecido pelos artigos e livros que trata do assunto, Graeber se autoclassifica como anarquista, não no sentido popular da palavra, entendida como bagunça e confusão, mas como conceito político. O Milênio foi conversar com Graeber em seu apartamento de Londres.
The explosion in Brazil came after widespread street protests in the Arab world, in Europe, Occupy Wall Street, in which you had considerable involvement. When you look at these simultaneous explosions, do you find elements more in common than you find to differentiate them?
Absolutely. I think that we have a new paradigm of what a democratic movement is, and that's what started to happen with the Arab Spring. And as you say, there was a kind of contagion. It spread through southern Europe, and then once it hit America, it sort of started going viral everywhere. It's bouncing up. You had Occupy Nigeria, South Africa, Pakistan, Hong Kong, pretty much everywhere on earth. And there was a mass movement of repression, especially in the United States, but something happened, I think, after 2011. There's a fundamental break because I think what's happened, and this shows why the protests in Brazil and Turkey, other places that followed, took the form that they did, that people really abandoned the idea that a democratic movement means forming a political party, means trying to participate in the formal political process. So I think people recognize that the formal political process isn't really democratic, and it can never be. It doesn't really matter who you vote for. Policies are set by kind of global bureaucracy, which is ultimately answerable to finance and capital. And really it makes no difference. You can't reform the structure. So from now on, it seems that when people have a democratic movement, it's going to take the form of self-organized, direct democracy, direct action, and people trying to solve their own problems and essentially embarrassing the politicians into doing things by demonstrating their irrelevance.
Some people criticize the fact that these movements, they don't have leaders, they don't have a list of demands. That's not the traditional way of doing it. It's not going to go anywhere. So you think that's essentially a part of it?
I can speak for Occupy Wall Street. That's why it worked. There had been effort after effort to take the conventional route, to make a list of demands, to get spokesmen. Even Zuccotti Park, there was an attempt to occupy Zuccotti Park 6 months before we did it, which did exactly that. They had a list of 27 demands of the government, they had spokesmen, they had trained media teams, they had a top-down organization. They took the conventional route, and 10 people showed up. They went nowhere. Nobody really wants to do that anymore because no one believes it's going to work. When we showed up with direct democracy, everyone equally participating, and refusal to join the political process, which we saw as essentially corrupt, suddenly thousands of people showed up. Suddenly we had 800 occupations across America.
You are a defender of anarchism as a political stand, as a policy, not anarchism in the popular sense of uncontrolled riots that people seem to understand it, as a historical and political concept. To what extent do you think that political anarchism is playing a role in these street demonstrations?
I think it's a central inspiration. And obviously, you have to bear in mind that the anarchism we're talking about nowadays is very different than the kind of anarchism we had in the 1890s or even the 1930s. It's infused by feminism, for example, consensus process, which has come to be seen as anarchist process, really comes out of feminism. There's even certain spiritual traditions that have played a big role. But the basic commitment of anarchism, I like to think of it as a matter of horizons. You know, we look forward to a world without systematic structures of violent coercion, without police, without courts, without prisons.
Without a state, without a government.
Without a state, yes. Without a state doesn't mean, say, without a public health care service. I mean, but it wouldn't be run by a centralized structure of bureaucratic coercion. The problem is right now we have states which insist that they're the only people who can possibly run such things. We think that people could run them democratically by themselves. So for me, what anarchism means is a commitment to create that kind of world. The real essence of anarchism for me is a rejection of the notion that the ends justify the means. A rejection of the notion that you can create a free society by giving more power to the police, that you can create a free society by coercion, that you can create a more democratic society by centralizing power, that we have to go towards a more authoritarian system to ultimately create a more free system. That's been a failure everywhere it's been tried. It's never worked. And there's no reason to believe it ever will. We have to start by creating the institutions of a free society now. And that's why anarchists talk about direct democracy and also direct action. I like to think of it as the defiant insistence on acting as if you were already free. Let's try to create the kind of structures that could exist without coercion right now.
That requires a lot of trust in people, that people without a state, without a government, without these repressive institutions, they will, let's say, behave properly.
Most of them.
Do you expect them to?
Well, actually, I have empirical evidence on this regard. I'm an anthropologist. I myself lived in such a place. I was in a part of rural Madagascar where the police had pulled out about 10 years before. And in fact, the government wasn't really functioning. It provided school teachers, but that was about it. And the amazing thing was it took me about 6 months to even figure out that this was what was happening. Because people were just going about their business as if the government were there and hoping nobody would notice.
At the other extreme, even in Africa, not too far from Madagascar, we have the example of Somalia, where the state disappeared, and what we got was total chaos.
Yes, but the state didn't really disappear in Somalia. What happens is the state disappeared into like 80 little states. I mean, if the state authority dissolves while people are already having a civil war, which was what was in fact going on, well, likely as not, the civil war won't stop immediately. But the irony is that I've heard it said that actually living standards and life expectancy, even in Somalia, which is the worst case scenario, have actually improved since the state is dissolved.
In your book, Democracy, there's a point there when you say towards the end that it's necessary, in your words, to reclaim communism. You obviously don't mean the line, the North Korean or Soviet line.
No, it's the very opposite of what anarchism believes.
Exactly. Yeah. So what communism is that you want to reclaim?
Well, I mean, in the sense that I'm talking about communism, it's something we're already doing all the time. I mean, the slogan of communism in the 19th century was from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. If you think about it, much of what you do is based on that. If you're cooperating with someone to solve a problem or to do some kind of job. I mean, even if you're working for ExxonMobil or Bechtel or some large capitalist corporation, if I say to someone, can you hand me the wrench, they don't say, yeah, what do I get for that? You actually operate on the basis of, well, this is what I need, this is what I've got, and because it's the only thing that works. It's practical. On that level, I think most of what we do has a certain element of communism in it, and some of what we do is purely based on communism. We're all communists with our best friends, with members of our family. And in any society where people get on together on any sort of civil level, there's a minimal kind of communism. I call it baseline communism. So in a similar way, I'd say all societies are based on communism. Even all corporations internally are based on communism. in a way, capitalism is just a bad way of organizing communism. So what I'm interested in is trying to figure out a better way to organize communism.
That transformation, that revolution, as it were, who's going to be leading? Who's going to be ahead of the movement? Workers, unemployed people, students?
If you look at the history of revolutions, sort of like, Chairman Mao, a rich farmer turned librarian, meets Zhou Enlai, or Castro, meets Che Guevara. There's always somebody coming up from the bottom, somebody descending from the top. I imagine that there's always going to be similar alliances being created. And you saw a lot of that in Occupy Wall Street, for example. There were the students who came from poor backgrounds, worked hard, got into college, ended up saddled with enormous amounts of debts and unable to get jobs because a bunch of bankers crashed the economy. And then there were a few people who were born to that class who rejected their parents' values and joined in. So those kind of alliances always exist.
In movements, the Occupy Wall Street, as the demonstrations in Brazil and many other places, there's always a group that is more active, sometimes more violent.
Militant.
More militant. You associate them, the so-called black blocs and all that. To what extent are they following the principle of anarchism and what they do and the role they play?
It's important to bear in mind that black blocs, the ones I've experienced here in the UK and North America, actually consider themselves nonviolent, but they're practicing a much more militant form of nonviolence. There's a classic example. In 1999, a lot of the people who were in the black bloc in Seattle had been tree sitters. They were doing Gandhian nonviolence. They were defending forests, old-growth forests that had been cut down. And essentially the police started using extraordinarily violent tactics. One person was killed while defending a tree. Other people were tortured. They were doing things like rubbing pepper spray in the eyeballs of people who were locked down. And normally the way Gandhian tactics work is that you sort of demonstrate the violence of the state, just how far they're going to go against completely nonviolent people, and it causes a scandal. Because of the nature of the media in America, you can't report it that way. Basically, if the police do something that's authorized from above, it cannot be represented as violence, no matter what it is. So the people who had been doing those tactics were so scandalized, they said, all right, we're going to do a different tactic now. We'll still be nonviolent, but we'll do something so dramatic they can't ignore it. So they smashed a lot of windows. They went and sort of researched all the most obnoxious corporations, made a list, found out where their venues were, and did symbolic breaking of glass. And that went all over the world instantly. It became this great media outcry, and as a result, policies actually did change. So it was an effective tactic in that particular context.
So it works because it calls attention.
Yeah. And they, insofar as they didn't hurt anyone in doing so, you could say it's an effective example of nonviolent direct action.